This lecture is on nitrogen and water, and what we'll do is we'll look at a couple local examples and then relate that throughout. The Salish mostly focused on how climate change is going to impact our water resources, and a bit about nitrogen both in our water and in the marine system and how that's impacting the overall health of the Salish Sea. To begin, I'm going to go through a quick diagram of the nitrogen cycle, so we can kind of understand what nitrogen is, how it functions in the environment, and how we're altering it through anthropogenic impacts. If you want to learn a little bit more about the nitrogen cycle, there's a YouTube video down here you can watch. It's like a super cheesy, kind of cartoony nitrogen cycle. But nitrogen's an interesting nutrient because it exists in massive quantities. Nitrogen is the primary constituent of our air, yet in many instances nitrogen is limiting for plant growth. And that's because atmospheric nitrogen is not available as a nutrient for plants unless it's fixed into a form that is biologically available. So this giant pool of atmospheric nitrogen, but the plants can't just absorb that nitrogen and use it as a nutrient to support their growth. That nitrogen first has to go through fixation, and that's mediated by bacteria. That there's nitrogen fixing bacteria living in the root nodules of legumes, and so if you're a gardener, you might be aware of some nitrogen fixing plants, or the way that a lot of agriculture is done is the winter cover might be something that fixes nitrogen. So these little bacteria are taking the nitrogen and turning it into a bioavailable form that then the plant can utilize. Additionally, in the soil, there's other nitrogen fixing bacteria that take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it to ammonium. Ammonium is typically not available for uptake for the plants, meaning it's not what they need, but it can go through two other bacterial transitions. And so another bacteria can take ammonium and turn it into nitrites, and then there's another nitrifying bacteria that turns it into nitrates. Now nitrates are what the plants want. That's what they're primarily absorbing for nutrients. So if you're spreading fertilizer, you're typically spreading nitrates. Then these nitrates are absorbed by the plants. Plants photosynthesize, grow. Consumers eat the plants. They produce waste that's then decomposed or is full of ammonium that then goes through this nitrogen cycle again. So there's kind of a feedback loop here of nitrogen being absorbed by the plants, eaten by consumer, fecal matters decomposed, goes through ammonium, nitrites, nitrates, absorbed again. So there's a bit of a cycle right here. Now nitrogen can leave this cycle through denitrifying bacteria. This is bacteria that consumes nitrates and produces into nitrogen gas. So this is a basic cycle of the way that nitrogen functions in the environment. The important thing to know is that nitrates are primarily what plants are absorbing. Nitrogen gas is a primary constituent of our atmosphere and is not biologically available. In Washington, there's been a big study actually locally looking at how nitrogen is making it into our groundwater. And groundwater you can think of as this layer of water that's below kind of the surface sediment. So there's surface sediment, your yard, some distance below that where water can filter through, and then this deep layer of water that makes up our ground table. And that water is also layered. The younger water's on top and the older water's on the bottom. In other areas, like in California, it's been a big deal now where they're drilling down 300-400 feet to access what's frequently referred to as fossil water, so water that's on the order of thousands of years old. One example of that is drilling really deep wells to water almonds. It's been a big push in California. Here we've got a really shallow groundwater table, and we'll kind of go over that. But what is relevant is this sort of root zone here. This is where your the roots are, also where the shallow sediment, so think a couple feet deep, 10, 15, 20, 30 at most, more like 5. Where your septic systems are, where animal manure, fertilizer, and irrigated crops, where most of that nitrogen is kind of contained in this upper zone of the sediment. And then as it rains, that water's percolating down, filtering down into the groundwater table. And you can have a shallow well that's drinking this younger water, it's taking up this younger water, or a deeper well that's picking up this older water. And the age of the water will have an impact on how much of this stuff is in there, right? So septic systems, fertilizer, all of these are recent things. So fertilizer, septic waste would be prevalent in younger water. In older water that could be on the order of a few hundred years old, it obviously wouldn't have those contaminants. So depending on where you get your water, really dictates how much of these contaminants could potentially be in there. Here, this is a map of Whatcom County. Bellingham's down here. This is the Sumas-Blaine Aquifer. So Sumas is over here, Blaine's over here. This is the aquifer for most of Whatcom County. And it's really interesting because it's really, really shallow. And so if you've driven around Whatcom County, if you're driving out through kind of the rolling hills and the farms, you often see like small ponds or marshes. That's a good indication that the water table is really, really shallow. So for most of the Sumas-Blaine Aquifer, the water table is under 10 feet deep, meaning if you dug down 10 feet, you would hit water. And that has implications for nutrient absorption. And as fertilizers and septic kind of filter down through the sediment, how soon they interact with the water table. So we have a very, very shallow water table. So most of it's less than 10 feet deep. Some areas are 10 to 25 feet deep to the top of the water column, and then it goes down to a lower depth. So the top of the water table in the Sumas-Blaine Aquifer is very, very shallow. Now this is the thickness of the Blaine-Sumas Aquifer. So it's on most of the areas it's 10 feet deep, so you have to dig down 10 feet to get to the top of the water table. And this is telling you how thick it is. And so in the western part of the aquifer, it's less than 25 feet deep. So if you dug down to 10 feet, you got to the top of it. You dug down to another 25 feet below that, you'd be to the bottom of the water table. It increases in depth as you go east. But in general, we're talking about a relatively thin layer of water that's relatively shallow. So on average, we're thinking of a water table that's 10, 15 feet below the surface. That extends between 25 and 50 feet down below. Some areas a bit more, particularly here on the eastern side. So this sets up a system where, one, if you're thinking about how that groundwater interacts with the surface soil, the root zone that has fertilizer, septic systems, things like that, that water table is quite close to that. It's relatively thin, meaning that the differences in age between the top of the aquifer and the bottom of the aquifer are not that great. If you have a really deep aquifer, like say that aquifer is 50, 100 feet thick, then you'd have a larger age difference between the top of the aquifer and the bottom. In this case, it's relatively thin, so there's not a huge age difference. And in this area, there's been a lot of work looking at the amount of nitrogen in these aquifers, and we'll go through some of the data showing that there's some nitrogen concerns in the Sumas-Blaine Aquifer. This is a pretty interesting graph. This is the distribution of the estimated annual nitrogen inputs to the land and subsurface of the SBA, Sumas Blaine Aquifer. So we mentioned that there's tons and tons of dairy cows in Whatcom County producing a ton of fecal matter. But when we look at how much of that nitrogen from the waste of dairy cows makes it into the Sumas Blaine Aquifer, the direct impact of the dairy lagoons is quite small, 1.2%. Now these are lagoons on site for the per the Nutrient Management Act. Dairies have to contain all of the waste, and they have to have some place for it to go. So they hold all of that waste in a lagoon, a giant manure lagoon, until they have some place for it to go. The amount of nitrogen that leaks out of those dairy lagoons is actually quite small. There's a fair amount of regulation around these. Some of them have to be clay lined or concrete lined. They have to do percolation tests to make sure that water's not flowing through these lagoons. So they're pretty good about containing nitrogen. The biggest source of nitrogen to the aquifer is manure applied to crops. So every gallon and pound of that manure has to have a place to go per the Nutrient Management Act. Most dairy producers then spread that manure on silage corn and grass to feed the cows. Silage corn is also cow feed. That manure cannot be spread on crops for human consumption because of contamination concerns. And so the major source of nitrogen to the aquifer is manure from dairy cows, but it's not from the physical footprint of the dairy operation. It's from spreading that manure out on fields to grow more food for the dairy cows. The next largest contributor are fertilizers. So these are typically anthropogenic fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, things like that. Followed by a number of kind of smaller sources, atmospheric deposition, legumes, and so natural processes here. Natural processes are 5% of the total. Irrigation and on-site sewage is 1.2. So really the biggest ones are applying manure to crops and fertilizers. Far and away are the two largest contributors of nitrogen to the Sumas Blaine Aquifer. Now this nitrogen gets into the water table by leaching down through the sediment. So this is a very grainy image showing sources of nitrogen up above, manure, fertilizer, making it into the plants, into the soil. What's happening is it's going through the nitrogen cycle. Ammonia is being nitrified into nitrate, and some of that's leaching down into the water table. But in this instance, this is during the summer, the water table is well below this root zone where all the nitrogen action is happening. So there's very minimal leaching because the mechanism for that leaching is water running down through the sediment, carrying nitrogen with it. And in this instance, the nitrogen is up above the water, so they're physically separated. So we're not getting a lot of nitrogen in the water during the summer because they're physically separated. The water's down below the root zone. However, during the winter, that water table rises, right? So it's raining during the fall and the winter. It can raise 16 to 30 inches, and then it starts to interact with the root zone that's been building up nitrogen all summer long. And this is the main mechanism for nitrogen getting into the groundwater, is that the groundwater is physically coming up to interact with the root zone, or there's a ton of rain and that water's percolating down through the sediment. As it's percolating down through the sediment, it's picking up nitrogen and bringing that down to the groundwater. In the Sumas Blaine Aquifer, these are data from Department of Ecology. You can follow this link and take a look at it. It's a pretty cool website. It's like a map interface, and you can click on all these different wells all throughout the Sumas Blaine Aquifer. and look at the actual nitrogen values and whether or not they're meeting that regulatory limit. The regulatory limit for nitrate per EPA, it's kind of hard to read here, this is over it, is 10 milligrams nitrogen per liter. So the regulatory limit's 10 milligrams of nitrogen per liter. These data are showing a single well through time. The well depth is 26 feet. For most of this time, it's doing fine. April 2003, July, October, back down to January, April. So let's just look at this pattern really quickly. So here's that winter recharge and an increase in nitrogen. So between October and January, there's more nitrogen in the system compared to summers before and after, primarily driven by that recharge. And then all of a sudden, in the winter of 2004, 2005, those nitrogen values go way, way, way up. What's likely happening in this case is that nitrogen has been building up in the root zone for a fair amount of time, and the aquifer gets high. There's enough rain to bring the aquifer up to interact with the root zone, and these numbers get really, really high, with values of over 20 milligrams nitrogen per liter, which is double the regulatory limit. So in this case, the nitrogen is kind of like a ticking time bomb in the root zone, and once the water gets high enough to interact with that root zone, it's absorbing all that nitrogen that's been building up for perhaps, in this case, a number of years. So if we look at this cycle again, what are the major processes that are driving this increase in nitrogen? We talked a bit about cows. You could replace this bunny with a cow, consuming plants, producing fecal matter that's then adding nitrate to the soil. But there's a major piece that's missing in the Sumas-Blaine aquifer. It's the second most important contributor to nitrogen. In other areas, it's the primary contributor to nitrogen. And that's not depicted on this chart, which is the addition of synthetic nitrogen or synthetic fertilizers. So the advent of synthetic fertilizers, it's quite easy and cheap to add nitrogen to your farm or your lawn or whatever it might be. And currently there's about 120 million tons of synthetic nitrogen are used globally. For reference, that's twice the amount from organic sources, i.e. Manure or legumes. So we have over twice as much synthetic nitrogen being added to the system than that's added through organic means. I'm not going to say natural, because it's probably not natural to have 60,000 cows in Whatcom County, but it's an organic process compared to the synthetic nitrogen, where you can create nitrogen through synthetic means. You can, with electricity, you can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into a synthetic fertilizer that are now very, very cheap to produce, very cheap to use. And we do need nitrogen to grow food. We're trying to feed a lot of people. So there's utility in having synthetic nitrogen, but we need to understand how it's impacting the environment, and are there ways that we could use this nitrogen more efficiently? So now the number one source of nitrogen is not organic sources, it is synthetic nitrogen. And thinking about the Salish as a watershed, right? Salish is not just the salt water, it's the whole watershed. And the Salish and the rivers and streams within the Salish are the endpoint for all of this nitrogen. That whatever is applied on land eventually works its way down to the marine environment, and estuarine environment. So using a whole bunch of nitrogen is not necessarily bad. It's the question of where does it end up and how does it get there. So one way we can talk about this quantitatively is the nitrogen use efficiency NUE. This is saying if I put out a pound of nitrogen on my farm, how much of that is absorbed by the plants and how much of it runs off. If I put a pound of nitrogen on my farm and half of it runs off, I would have a 50% nitrogen use efficiency. Globally, our nitrogen use efficiency in 1961 was 50%. So half of the nitrogen that we applied would be utilized, the other half would run off. Today it's 42%. In India, in the past 20 years, fertilizer application has doubled, and their nitrogen use efficiency has gone from 40% to 30%. China in 1961 had a nitrogen use efficiency of 60%, so higher than the global average. Today it's 25%, so below the global average. What's happening is both farming practices have changed, as well as the advent of cheap synthetic nitrogen, where prior, if you're doing more of an integrated agricultural system, you're recycling nitrogen created on site, animal waste. But now you can do more monocrop agriculture fed by cheap synthetic fertilizer. And so the relative cost of dumping a bunch of fertilizer on your plot of land is very low, and if half of that runs off, that's fine, it didn't cost you that much. You're still going to get a marginally higher yield, which would make it economically viable. This is an example from China, but just to kind of go through what this looks like, and it's sort of an interesting model because there's a big movement for local foods, small ag, community-based agriculture, things like this, and this is sort of a comparison between those two. So this is for China before and after their transition to industrial farms. And so prior, using traditional farms, these were smaller, kind of more single-family, maybe multi-family operations, where you had a few animals. That manure was recycled on both crops to feed those animals, but also crops for human use. Minor amounts of synthetic fertilizer, minor amounts of river discharge and runoff and leaching. So most of the nitrogen that was created was used on site, some augmentation from synthetic fertilizer, but for every farm animal you had, you also had a fair amount of acreage to spread that waste or that manure. Now under an industrial style farming, it's more like the Western style of, warehouses growing chickens, cows, and pigs, which are producing massive amounts of waste. Most of that's being discharged into nearby rivers. Some of that's, a small fraction, is being recycled for fruits, vegetables, and other crops. But the main source of nitrogen for those crops is now synthetic fertilizers. So this is causing eutrophication, which is the word for too many nutrients. It's creating eutrophication in the river systems, which causes algal blooms. When the algae die, they decompose, consume oxygen, creates these hypoxic or low oxygen areas. And then these nutrients go out in the coastal waters and produce red tides or harmful algal blooms. And it's very similar to what we're seeing here. It's very similar to what we see in Bellingham Bay, with a fair amount of nutrients coming out of the Nooksack River. Bellingham Bay has some of the lowest oxygen values in Puget Sound. There's a couple in the Salish Sea in Canada that kind of rival it, and some low oxygen zones in Hood Canal as well. But we have some pockets of low oxygen in Bellingham Bay as well. So how does that relate to the Salish Sea, or what are the largest sources of nitrogen in the Salish Sea? And it's actually a bit of a surprise, but I think we have to think about what we can control and what we can't control. So the largest source of nitrogen in the Salish Sea, and the reference is down here if you want to look it up, is oceanic, meaning that the majority of nitrogen in the Salish, comes from the open ocean, it moves in and upwells, it spreads out throughout the Salish. So just the ocean has a bunch of nitrogen and it's bringing it into the Salish as the waters move in and out. 2,600 to 2,900 tons of nitrogen per day. Our riverine sources actually are not that large, so 160 tons of nitrogen per day. So that's a big difference between the oceanic and riverine sources. That the riverine or the river sources tend to be much, much less than the naturally occurring oceanic sources. Sewage is about 100 tons per day, so that's one that we can certainly, we're both contributing to the amount of nitrogen in the rivers. Also, sewage is pretty much all of our contribution to the Salish, and so those are factors we can think about and control. Groundwater is relatively low at 15 tons per day. Some of that's natural. The majority of that is anthropogenic. So looking at this, you can say, well, why should we care? Like if we add up all of our sources, we're 275 tons per day, 275 tons per day. The ocean's bringing in 10 times that. So we're 10% of the overall, less than 10% of the overall amount of nitrogen entering the Salish Sea every day. What's the big deal? We should just dump and not worry about it. A lot of it has to do with the, we'll look at the spatial and temporal distribution become important. So if it's not necessarily 10% applied evenly everywhere, that 10% is located in a very small area. So you can think of it as if we had 10% more spread evenly, maybe not such a big difference. But if we had 10% more nitrogen added in a half a percentage of the area, then the relative contribution of that is really important. Maybe a bad analogy is you could say global temperatures have only gone up 1/4 of a degree, but if your house is on fire, you can say, well, on average, the globe hasn't gone up that much, but your house is on fire, which is a more concern to you than the overall average. So the distribution is more important than the average. The quote I've heard is that you could say nitrogen, like money, exists in sufficient quantities but is not evenly distributed. So the distribution of nitrogen is not even. For the ocean, the net nitrogen exchange comes from the Pacific Ocean through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And then you can kind of see Puget Sound arm of the Salish. That nitrogen exchange only really occurs right here at Admiralty Inlet. It's between Whidbey Island and the peninsulas. There's a major source of water flushing back and forth. The other one's Deception Pass, which is quite small. So you can see this area here where the flux of water in and out is very low, that the residence time of water here is quite long, that water hangs out for a long time, where it flushes back and forth here pretty quickly. This is a distribution of wastewater loading. Looking at, this is the annual dissolved inorganic nitrogen load in kilograms per day. So a different figure than we were looking at before. It's the annual amount of wastewater entering the Salish. Not surprisingly, there's a whole bunch happening down here through Puget Sound. Again, very low exchange of this water with the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the open Pacific, right? So all of this nitrogen's added to a very small area that the water's not flushing out. It's just being added and being added and being added. A fair amount up here in Vancouver. Fair amount here in Bellingham. The Victoria, quick update on Victoria, they are putting in an actual sewage treatment plant, so it's not just dumping raw sewage into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. However, with that said, this area does exchange much quicker than it does, say, down here in Seattle. So this is actually a much larger ecological impact than Victoria dumping raw sewage, because that raw sewage is getting flushed in and out Here, the treated sewage, which still contains a fair amount of nitrogen, is being dumped into an area where it's just sloshing back and forth and not being exchanged, not being pushed out in the open ocean. So you can see our distribution of nitrogen is not even. And I want to look at this and then we compare it to the riverine sources, which is interesting because the rivers have been there. We're adding more nitrogen to it, but rivers are where they're at. And so think about the distribution of sewage treatment plants, which mirrors the distribution of people, and how that would compare to the natural flow of rivers. So keep this in your mind, and we'll jump forward. So here, there's still some in the South Sound, but we're not built out as much here. There's Everett, Mount Vernon have large rivers. There's more river sources along the peninsulas. There's larger river sources up here where we do not have large populations of people. No large rivers in Victoria. Some out in the islands, but it looks a fair amount different. This is the Fraser River. Let me jump back and forth. So camera 1, camera 2. Yeah, it's interesting. Hood Canal here has some riverine sources. The Hood Canal does get a fair amount of sewage, but mostly from leaky septic systems, not from direct sewage treatment plants, which is actually a worse issue. And then we can look at this distribution compared to agricultural areas. So where is the majority of farming happening? Skagit is a big agriculture area, as is Whatcom. Whatcom is a largely agricultural-based economy. We have a lot of agriculture here. So we can look at these areas and think about that in relationship to the distribution of nitrogen in groundwater. And so we've talked about a fair amount of nitrogen in the groundwater here in the Sumas Plain Aquifer. We haven't really spent time talking about Skagit, but we can look at that through this heat map where this is the probability of detecting elevated nitrate concentrations in groundwater. So the probability of measuring nitrogen at or near the regulatory limit, that probability is very high in the Sumas Plain Aquifer. It's very high in Skagit. It's also very high in Seattle. And that's mostly driven by the fact that homeowners actually spread a fair amount of fertilizer. They actually spread a lot of fertilizer and a lot of pesticides at a much higher rate than agricultural industries do, because me as a homeowner can go out and buy a sack of weed and feed and dump it on my lawn. It costs me $10. Like, I'll over apply it. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't cost me much, right? Between a proper application of weed and feed, it might cost me $3 for my lawn. I can use that same sack for three times. Or I buy that $10 sack and I just spread the whole darn thing, buy another one next year. That cost differential is $7, you know, whatever, it's a latte, just dump it out in the yard, and more is better, right? Where if you're managing hundreds of acres or thousands of acres, you're going to be much more precise in your applications, because adding a few percent more will start to add up. And so you tend to see more pesticide, herbicide, and fertilizer uses in urban areas. So we have these impacts of nitrogen that come from various sources: oceanic, riverine, sewage. There's strong correlations with agricultural areas and elevated nitrogen. The Sumas Plain Aquifer is shallow and thin and has a lot of nitrogen. Most of that nitrogen is coming from manure applied to crops and synthetic fertilizers. Kind of a recap of things to know before we jump into our water supply. And we have to think about water for a few different things. Obviously, we need water to drink. We need water at our tap. Shockingly, nature needs some water as well. And water coming into the Salish Sea helps drive circulation. So if we turn off all the rivers, the Salish Sea will actually be really harmed because that fresh water, you could think about the Salicy like a treadmill, where there's the stuff on the bottom. The bottom of the treadmill comes up to be the top of the treadmill, so it's like rotating around like this. That's driven by fresh water, kind of driving that conveyor belt. And if that fresh water turns off, then the Salish becomes stagnant, which has a lot of issues with reduced oxygen values in the water, which harms fish and invertebrates, as well as the cycling of nutrients that are needed for phytoplankton production. So fresh water is an important driver for ocean circulation as well. So these are a number of climate change models looking at what the relative difference in precipitation is going to look like in the Salish Sea. So the way to look at these, they're pretty to look at, but to figure out what they actually mean, here are the different types of models. They're kind of irrelevant, the differences between them at this stage. These are months: December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. Okay, so now we're months. We have this line, we have 10, we have positive numbers and negative numbers. So this is looking at the precipitation percent difference for the prediction from 2071 through 2100 relative to 1950 through 1999. So this is saying positive numbers mean more precipitation in 2071 through 2021, so the future, compared to the past, 1950 through 1999. So we can look and right away for December, January, February. Most of these are in the positive. So these are scatter plots. These are our medians here. Generally, we're looking at more rain December, January, February, March, April, May, slightly more rain, June, July, August, less precipitation, and September, October, November, slightly more precipitation. So on the surface, that could be, well, that's a good thing, right? We're getting more rain. In this area, precipitation, I should say precipitation, not rain. Precipitation in the winter is vitally important because that's our snowpack. The melting of that snowpack is what feeds the rivers through time. So I'm going to close the window. That's what feeds our rivers through time, and that snowpack is vitally important because that's cool water melting, filling the rivers with cool water for salmon habitat. If that goes away, then we don't have that cool source of water, or that source of water, period, which is what's really keeping our streams alive. Low summer rainfall is of big concern because that's what most of our plant communities need to make it through the summer. They get stressed all summer. Little bits of rain become really important. So on one hand, this could be okay, assuming that that precipitation is still falling as snowfall. However, if this change in distribution of precipitation is accompanied by an increase in temperature, now we're in trouble. If this is falling as rain as opposed to snow, that rain is going to fall, run down the streams, and be gone. And we will not have that snowpack, both for water storage that we use for drinking water, but also water storage and a cool source of water for fish and wildlife. Additionally, if you do get snow still during the winter, but your spring rains are warmer than normal, that warm rain will melt the snow that exists in the mountains, creating flooding, which scours out the river, which kills salmon eggs and causes coastal flooding and damage to property. So just looking at the precipitation, 3 out of 4 ain't bad, right? 3 out of 4 are going up, but it's the type of precipitation, when it's occurring, and kind of what form that really matters more so than maybe the overall amount. Although hot, dry summers and warm or wet winters is really what we're predicting to see. So hot, dry summers meaning more wildfires, more drought, more loss of native plants, and warmer, wetter winters meaning lots of rain, but it's not sticking as snowfall. And that's backed up by looking at our predicted temperature increases. So this is a historical temperature record ending about now. These are two different models. One is best case if we implement a bunch of actions to reduce carbon dioxide. The other one is if kind of business as usual. So they start to diverge up here. And this is temperature. So for that same region of 2075 to 2100, which isn't that far away. We're not talking about 100 years from now. We're talking about relatively soon time periods, kind of our lifetime periods, your lifetimes anyway. Seeing these rises in temperature of, these are in Fahrenheit, but even a few degrees Fahrenheit rise would be enough to turn a lot of our snowfall into rainfall. And that's enough to make those big changes that we're talking about with the way that precipitation falls. This is a really cool website. It's climate.northwestknowledge.net, and there's this toolbox where you can scroll around, and this one's meant for looking at traditional areas. So we talk about usual and custom areas, and so this is a way for tribes to look at their usual and custom areas to look at how that's going to impact rainfall. And so I've selected my tribe, the Salish Indian Nation, and I'm interested in the Salish area of traditional occupation. And for one of our main areas on South Lopez, we're actually looking at a potential increase of rain by 1.2 inches. But again, that's, when it falls is also important. So most of the plants need more water during the summer. If they're getting more rain during the winter, but not less rain during the summer, it's actually a net negative, even though it might appear to be a net positive. And then for Orcas Island, a potential increase here as well of 2.3 inches. And this is interesting. So again, this averages tell part of the picture, but what really, really matters, and I think what structures ecosystems frequently as well, are extremes. And so these are the number of very high fire danger days. And it's predicted, you can see that heat map here, we're predicted to have a lot more very high fire danger days. And so these hot, dry summers are very likely to increase wildfires. And we've seen a lot of wildfires recently. It's due to a combination of hot, dry, land use practices, but we're really set up for some bad fire dangers. And a big fire on the islands is tough to contain because they don't have a lot of the infrastructure to fight fires. And then the other concern is stream temperature. So these summer temperatures of high stream values both impact when salmon return and also juvenile salmon rearing or growing in these streams to the point where it can be cause mortality. It can be deadly. And we've seen that for sockeye returning to different reaches of the Columbia where the water is so warm. These adult fish lived out their whole life and they're just a few feet away from the end and laying some eggs, and the water's too warm and they just die in the stream before they even get to spawn. And so that's another impact we could see. Here it's predicted to have about a 4.3 degree Fahrenheit increase in stream temperature, which is a big increase. And so again, with the extremes, so thinking about those extreme hot days, and the extreme hot days matter for the terrestrial, but they also really matter for the intertidal as well. During the summer, our low tides are during the day, and we just finished our lowest lows of the year, which is around the 4th of July. Those low tides are like at noon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. If it's 80, 90 plus degrees out, most of those critters on the intertidal are literally cooking on the rocks. That the rocks are black, they absorb the energy. They can get to be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They're going to kill all these animals. So most of our death in the intertidal happens during these hot summer days. With climate change, we're predicted to have an increase of 11 days with the maximum temperature above 86 degrees. So that's 11 more days of above 86 degree weather, which is both drying out and killing plants. It's also drying out and cooking intertidal critters as well. So that's a major concern. So as we change our precipitation, one of the questions becomes, well, if this precipitation is coming during the winter, as rain, it's running off. The summer is less water. We need to think of other ways to obtain drinking water. One way that's really effective, or cost effective and resource effective, is to reclaim water. And so this is the taking of sewage water, separating the sewage material from the drinking parts, and reusing that water. So water reuse is one of the most efficient ways to use water. It has been done around the world, and it's continuing to be done in different areas. Some of them, they use it for aquifer recharge, and so it's a little bit more palatable. Not from an actual taste perspective, but from like a perception. To take that water, treat it, and put it in the aquifer, and then have a straw right next to where you're dumping in treated sewage water to where you're pulling it out, and pulling out the aquifer water that way, compared to the closed system where the sewage goes through, gets treated, and goes directly into the drinking water system. Now, San Diego, Southern California, is out of water. They're doing desalination, which means they're taking seawater, taking the salt out, and putting it into the drinking water. For a long time, when I lived in San Diego doing my graduate work, they tried this toilet to tap. And that word toilet to tap really killed the project. That's just an image that most people are not really excited about, which is fair enough. But now they put in a desalination plant that uses massive amounts of electricity. They still don't have enough water. So now they're looking at moving ahead with treating water, calling it pure water, and putting that back into the drinking water system. And they really have to do something. They just don't have enough water in Southern California. We typically think of the Northwest as not having these kinds of problems. That's a Southern California thing. There's all these people. It's hot and dry. But I think looking at those systems is a good indication of what we're going to face in the future. Maybe later in kind of the mainland areas, but the island areas have very shallow aquifers. If they pull out too much water, they get seawater intrusion and their aquifers are permanently damaged. And so this is something that's very real and very now, and it's going to get worse in the future. So it's interesting to think about that as well. So for this second part of the lecture, I think it's important to think about timing and distribution, extremes, questions like, is more rain, more precipitation on average going to be a good thing or a bad thing, or what are the aspects of precipitation that really matter? So with that, Haishka, thank you.